So this afternoon I'm going to talk about one of the central concepts in environmental policy called sustainability and sustainable development. And we're essentially going to ask the question, what does this mean? More so than what does this imply? I'm going to do a little bit of the economic reasoning behind all this, and I'm going to end, as it looks now a bit more rushed than planned, with what was agreed earlier this week by the United Nations and endorsed by such people as you, Jackman. The first and I think best definition of sustainability was given by or published by in a book under the name of John Stuart Mill, and I apologize I think it was yesterday for putting up Mill, but not his wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, and in one of his final letters John Stewart actually admitted that most, if not all, of his work was really a co-production with her, and she should take pride of place in a lot of these attributions. But yeah, they co-wrote under the pseudonym of John Stuart Mill, right? And in their 1857 book, they wrote the following. If the earth must lose that great portion of its pleasantness which it owes to things that the unlimited increases of wealth and population would extirpate from it for the mere purpose of enabling it to support a larger but not a happier or a better population, I sincerely hope for the sake of posterity that they will be content to be stationary long before necessity compels them to it. So this is written in the time of, shortly after the time of Malthus, right? So Mill sort of shares this notion that the planet is finite and therefore it can support only a finite population, and at some point the number of people would need to stabilize, so that sort of explains what is going on there. But Mill really says here is that our aim should not be a maximum number of people, that really we should stop at a smaller number than the maximum possible, because if we go for the maximum human population, then we're going to, as he calls it, extirpate a lot of the things that bring pleasure to life, namely wild nature, animals, plants, and those sort of things. So that is one sentiment they express here, and the other sentiment that they express here is that this is not for them, but this is for posterity, for future generations. Now, they did have a daughter together, actually. I don't know whether there were any grandchildren. They definitely had a daughter together. But the sentiment here is that sustainability is not something for us, but it's something that spans generations. It's an intergenerational contract or an intergenerational constraint. So this was 1857, the first, perhaps most eloquent definition of sustainability. And then zoom forward to 1987, the World Commission on Environment and Development released a report by a committee chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland, typically known as the Brundtland Report, defines sustainable development as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Shorter, less eloquent, but it gives essentially the same sort of meaning. Now, this was wildly successful, this report and this definition. Before 1987, nobody talked about sustainability or sustainable development. After 1987, everybody talked about this. Basically, all countries on the planet have somehow, somewhere in their legislation or their mission or whatever, have endorsed sustainable development, that this is what we want. All major companies on the planet have in their mission statement that they want to be sustainable or contribute to sustainable development. And it is, as I said, wildly successful. Nobody disagrees with this. And if you read the words, it's very hard to disagree with this, right? Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present. That's a good thing, right? That's us, and we're not going to compromise our own needs. And at the same time, we're not going to hurt future generations, which is also sort of the decent thing to do. Right? It's very hard to disagree with the sentiment that is expressed here, and that is why basically everybody signed up to it. Now, it's very hard to disagree with what is said here, and that's because it's actually very difficult to pinpoint what does it actually say. What do we really do here? We're talking about development, but that's sort of a woolly term. What does meeting the needs of the present mean? We know what the present is, roughly. What are the needs of the present? Does that mean that everybody has a sufficient amount to eat? Does it include housing? Does it include freedom of speech? I occasionally feel the need to what's 10, the longer the better. Is that a need of the present? Or is that a luxury? And even if you have agreed on what those needs are, what does meeting them mean? Do we meet them 100%? Are we happy with meeting them 90%? Are we happy with meeting them 50%? And similarly for the future, right? We don't know what our own needs are. That's difficult enough. But what will the needs of future generations be? We haven't met them, right? So we don't know much about them. What does compromising their ability really mean? So at an intuitive level, it's pretty clear what Brundtland meant here. But at a precise level, it is not, right? So that implies that different people can read very different things into this definition. And that implies that everybody can sign up, because everybody can give their own precise meaning to this. We all agree, right? It's sort of like saying, please leave the toilet the way you would like to find it. I mean, nobody disagrees with it, right? I think that's one of the strengths of this definition, that it's sort of this vague, intuitive notion that therefore we can all agree on, and it sort of sets a direction of travel that is also reasonably clear. Academics, of course, don't like this sort of stuff. They don't like vague definitions, and they're being all pedantic and going to say, like, what does need mean, and what do you mean by present? Is that 2015, or is that the decade 2010 to 2020, or what do you mean? Or maybe it's just now. So academics being academics, they said, well, we can't have a vague definition, let's come up with a precise definition. And academics being academics, they can't agree on what the precise definition should be. People stopped counting on latest counts, but it is now 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There were 500 alternative definitions of sustainability. They're all very precise, they're all very different. I won't take you through all 500 of them. Probably there's now 1,000 or 1,500. But I will take you through the two main groups, weak sustainability and strong sustainability. Of course, if you have weak sustainability and strong sustainability, you have also people who argue for intermediate sustainability or in between sustainability. I'm just going to stick with two main groups. And then at the very end return to what is going on outside of academia. So, starting with weak definitions of sustainability. Jeff Pazzi here argued that sustainability really means that utility doesn't fall. That we sort of like meeting the needs of the present. The degree to which we meet needs is measured in utility. That's what the utility function does. It's sort of like if you were mapping from our resource availability and our constraints and the budget constraints and all those sort of things, production technologies, to how happy we are. Right? That's what the utility function does in a general equilibrium setting. And meeting the needs and essentially means that you're reasonably happy. And if it's sort of like you spread it out over time, then that means that utility shouldn't fall. That's the condition that we can meet our needs and at the same time future generations can meet. Then it's, as long as people don't get more unhappy over time, then we're fine. Now, John Hardwick, who is very shy and does not like his picture taken, which here, argued that utility is hard to measure and poorly defined, and he said, well, really we should be focusing on consumption rather than utility. And then Solo is here. He did this in 74. I'm pretty sure it's 74, so he was a bit younger then. Argued that if the constraint is that consumption doesn't fall over time, or perhaps utility doesn't fall over time, and we are on a finite planet, so we have, by definition, because the planet has a finite size, we have a limited amount of copper, we have a limited amount of aluminium, we have a limited amount of oil, necessarily, and we're taking a very long view, we're looking over millennia, if not longer, then that finiteness plus the condition that utility should never fall or consumption should never fall implies that really consumption should be constant over time. Because there is a finite amount of stuff, and as soon as you start accumulating stuff too fast, then at some point somebody is going to get poorer because we are running out of stuff, right? So that was Solo's insight. He did it with a very formal and complicated model. But the intuition is this: there's a finite amount of stuff around. So if you're going to say nobody's ever going to get poorer, or no generation can ever be poorer than the previous generation, then the implication is that we're all equally either rich or poor, but we should keep these things constant. So this may sort of at first sight strike you as a precise definition of sustainability, but of course it is not. If we say that utility should not fall, then the immediate question pops up, whose utility? Is this the utility of the average person on the planet? Is this the average of the utilities? Is this nobody's utility should ever fall? That's hard, right? Because your utility will fall if a relative dies. And that's not something that you can prevent. So we should take somehow an average. Your utility will go up eventually if new children, if you become a parent, right? So on average these things sort of equal out, but you can't just say utility without specifying that you're taking an average of some sort or some sort of function of the utilities of people. Of course, you have difficulty in measuring utility, what should be included there. If utility shouldn't fall, then the question is, of course, at what time scale? Do we mean over a century? Do we mean over 10 years? Do we mean over a year? Do we mean over a minute? Right? I mean, bad example today. Suppose it was like nice weather and then all of a sudden a cloud came before the sun, then at that point your happiness falls, right? For most people at least. And that cannot be the definition of sustainability, right? It cannot be unsustainable that a cloud comes before the sun. So it cannot be sort of instantaneous utility. Do we mean over a period of a year or 10 years or a century? That is still undefined. The crucial part of the definition of this definition of sustainability is that what matters is the total happiness of human beings, the average happiness of human beings of some sort. But it doesn't really matter how we attain that utility. And that implies that if we cut down all the trees, but give everybody virtual reality so that they can enjoy a walk in the forest anyway, then that is fine. And from this perspective, you may even argue that a virtual walk in the forest is preferable to a real walk because you can edit out the mosquitoes and those sort of things, right? You can edit out the unpleasant experiences, the mud and the critters that you may encounter, and you can sort of guarantee that you will all meet in the virtual forest a couple of nights there and stuff like that. As long as it makes people happier, it is fine. It is sustainable. And that is a crucial assumption, a crucial characteristic of all weak definitions of sustainability. And that is why we have the word weak there. A few other economists have argued that utility is very difficult to measure, and it's sort of very peculiar that, we have great difficulty in knowing our own preferences. Now we're talking about long spans of times. So essentially we're also defining the preferences of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, and we sort of kind of assume that we know what they will think is best for them. Maybe we don't want to make that assumption and just focus on production opportunities. And what matters is that they have the ability to do things, but let them sort out for themselves what are they going to do with these possibilities, and whether or not, and what would make them happy. That's essentially a variant on this stuff, but now we're focusing on the production side rather than the consumption side of the economy. All the other questions remain. Framing things in a production function rather than a utility function does not change your measurement problems or your definition problems, because we may not know what makes future generations happy, but we also do not know how future generations will produce things, right? You just think back 100 years into the past, all the things that were not there and that we have now and that were completely unimaginable to your grandparents and to your great-grandparents, right? The alternative set of definitions of sustainable development are so-called strong definitions of sustainable development, and the perhaps most important one is that what matters are non-declining natural capital stocks. And this is associated with philosophers like Arne Naess, Aldo Leopold, and of course our current Pope has argued very similar things in Laudato Si. Pope, of course, is being cheered around the world at the moment for certainly people who haven't quite understood what he said, because he is quite radical. Strong sustainability is essentially that, if you take this literally, that the world should stay as it is. So what matters, we're going back to the example of the forest. If you cut down a forest, replace it with virtual reality, people are equally happy, that's fine from a weak sustainable perspective. It's wrong from a strong sustainable perspective, because there the idea is that the forest has an intrinsic right to continue to exist. So we're also in a very strong deep ecology, naturalist, moral philosophy kind of thinking. Essentially, what strong sustainability says that if you replace one thing by another thing, that's wrong, because everything is equally worthy. And cutting down trees is not okay, because those trees have a right to be there. Now, this appeals to some people. It's not very pragmatic, because essentially this means you can't do anything. Because whenever you do something, there's always something else that gets damaged. You can't even die, because if you die, your body needs to be buried, and you have to convert a plot of land from something that it was to a grave. You can't be cremated, because if you're cremated, you release CO2 and you change this composition of the atmosphere. And you can't let a body to rot, because that generates methane. And that also changes the composition of the atmosphere. But you can't eat either, right? Because then you're also changing the stock of food that was there. So if you take this too literally, you can't. You just can't. You can't do anything. So if you want to apply a strong definition of sustainability to actual policy making rather than writing philosophy books, or theology books, you must allow for some form or other of substitution and compensation. But how much, right? The European Commission actually has gone down this route quite strongly, and for instance, when Rotterdam Harbour was extended out into the sea, harbour got too small, so what do? If you're in the Netherlands, you're just going to reclaim some more land and move out into sea, because you can't move into land because there's all these people there. So they thought, let's move into the sea. The European Commission actually said, no, you can't. Because what you're doing is you're taking away from the stock of wild sea. And every biologist would tell you that if you sort of move out further into sea, things basically become a desert, right? All the interesting things that are happening in the sea are always around edges with land. And actually Rotterdam Harbour, through its extension, lengthened the coastline, so it actually became biologically more interesting. But no, the European Commission said, you're taking away part of the desert, the great desert that is the outer sea, and this somehow has to be compensated. And the only way in which Rotterdam Harbour could extend into the sea by poldering more land was to give up another polder. Essentially, the Netherlands had to remove some dikes and let the sea back into the land, and that was the only way in which the European Commission would agree to this expansion. Same rules apply in theory, at least, to the UK, but not quite in practice. Then the question is, of course, does a piece of sea near Rotterdam compensate? Is that equivalent to removing an old piece of sea near Rotterdam? Is that the same as creating a new piece of sea near Groningen? Logically, they're quite different. But you need to have some sort of rule, because you cannot keep it exactly as it was, because that means status, right? There's perhaps another problem, or there's two other problems, and that is, of course, what is the stock you want to maintain? And you can say we want to maintain the habitat, the way things function, ecosystems. You may say we want to maintain specific species, or you may say we want to maintain specific traits of species, genes. Then you get into the polar bear discussion. So if you say habitat, then the North Pole is sacrosanct, right? Because it's a unique habitat. There's all sorts of unique ecosystems and animals there. Can't be touched. If you're talking about individual species, then you could say, well, polar bears can also live in zoos. And if our aim is to maintain the polar bear, we do not necessarily have to maintain the North Pole, because polar bears breed very well in zoos. You can also say polar bears really are brown bears that are white. They happily interbreed. We know that if you put a polar bear in the North American forest, it will survive, it will be very happy, it will sort of stand out because all other bears are brown and this one is white. But genetically, they're not really different. So if your aim is to maintain genetic diversity in just the gene pool, polar bears do not matter. Because genetically, they're not particularly different from brown bears, to the extent that they can interbreed and generate viable offspring. Viable in the sense that the offspring can also breed. So that question is there. And of course we have the awkward question, what do we do with viruses and pests? Do they have a right to exist, yes or no? What do we do with the 4 stocks of smallpox that are out there? And they are maintained for military reasons. The US has 2 pools of smallpox. Hopefully Russia has 2 pools, and that's it. And that's sort of a mutually assured destruction, and they are maintained that way. I would say the world is a better place without smallpox. Because by now, right, smallpox has been eradicated in the wild a couple of generations ago. So maybe my parents still have some residual immunity against smallpox, but I don't, most likely, and you guys definitely don't. So if the smallpox ever gets out, you're dead, right? So I think the world will be a safer place without all that smallpox. Let's destroy the remaining stockpiles. But of course, if you're a deep ecologist, you may argue, smallpox have a right to exist, just like we do. So perhaps we should keep on breeding them in captivity. Questions, right? I gave you my answer, but you should find your own answer to questions like this. Very strong sustainability, deep ecology, naturalist, human philosophy. Some people say, well, really, I mean, maintaining stocks is not what it's about. It's sort of like this old Prager-like vision of ecology, that nature is static, and that we want to freeze it in time. We by now realize that nature is always changing, and really what matters is not that you maintain the stocks, but that you maintain the functionality of the ecosystem. How you maintain the yields of the ecosystem or the resource services. Sort of an in-between position. If the yields of resources, if the returns to natural capital are defined as returns to human beings, then of course we're again very close to a weak sustainability perspective. But of course you can also define ecosystem services, yields of natural capital as returns to other species or other ecosystem services. So it's, depending on what you really do with this, you can turn this into anthropocentric or perhaps a less anthropocentric viewpoint. We still have all the issues of how to define these things, what time scales, what spatial scales. But yeah, the main deviation from the really strong definitions of sustainability is that some form of substitution is allowed. So if you replace a coral reef that is just in front of your coast and therefore protect your coast against wave action, against storms, with a mangrove forest that also protects you against wave action against storms, then that's fine, because the functionality is the same. Of course, a mangrove forest doesn't look in any way like a coral reef. That's from a human perspective, right? We don't like to be flooded, and we don't like strong waves, so both these ecosystems provide protection. But also from an ecological perspective, both coral reefs and mangrove forests sort of provide refuge for fish, provide nurseries for young fish, and so on and so forth. So also there, in an ecological perspective, they sort of perform the same sort of services. And if this is your definition of sustainability, then replacing coral reefs with mangroves is perhaps not that bad. Of course, not all coral reefs with mangroves, but if you replace some here and there, that should be okay. And then other people have argued that perhaps we should not so much focus on specific services, but take a more holistic view, and if sort of services evolve over time, as long as the total ecosystem is stable or at least resilient, then perhaps we should not worry too much. So those are the weak definitions, the strong definitions. There's, of course, a couple of people have pointed out that sustainability is what we like it to be, right? Because it is a human concept. So if we want sustainability to be A, and we all agree, then sustainability is A, regardless of what nature may be, right? And some have taken this further and said, really, what matters is not so much the outcome, how we define sustainability, but really what matters is that we're all happy to sit together in a room and talk about a definition and then in the end agree. And then we're sort of moving to a libertarian view on sustainability, namely that what matters is that we all voluntarily sign up to this definition and the implications that it may have for our behavior, right? Now, 10 minutes left. I started with Mill and Mill, and then I moved to Brundtland, and what happened after Brundtland. As I said, sustainability is wildly popular. There's nobody who would openly argue against sustainable development. And all the major players have said, yes, this is what we want. Now, one of the things that happens if you have a successful movement is that you have people who jump on the bandwagon. And what has happened in the last 15 years or so is that the definition of sustainable development has changed from nature and environment to nature and environment, social equity, as well as economic efficiency or economic growth. And for a long time, people spoke about the three pillars of sustainability: environmental quality, social justice, and economic development. Now, I think that is perfectly understandable. If you see a success come by, you want to take part of that success, right? So for people who care about income distribution, we sort of felt pushed aside by the environmental agenda. They could sort of start arguing that environmental quality and an equal income distribution are one and the same thing, right? And I want to be part of this successful movement too, and get some of the funds and some of the political attention. That's perfectly understandable reaction. But of course, blurring three disparate things under one banner means that the trade-offs get lost. For instance, energy creates no end of environmental problems, from particulate matter to climate change, acid rain in between. So in order to solve environmental problems, what you need to do is start taxing the bad forms of energy, and that would make a switch to more expensive forms of energy or pay more for energy. And that's good for the environment. It's not good for economic growth. And it's not good for the income distribution either, because poorer people spend a larger share of their income on necessary goods and services, including energy. So any energy tax that you apply is necessarily a regressive tax. The poor pay disproportionately more than the rich. And a carbon tax or a particulate matter tax may be a very good idea from an environmental perspective. It's not such a good idea from a development perspective, and it's definitely a bad idea from an income distribution perspective. So calling all these things sustainability sort of hides the trade-offs. You're essentially saying, I'm doing this because of sustainable development. What do you mean, right? You lose the meaning of the word. Now, the 3 pillars were around for a long time. By now, the number of pillars has grown to 17. This is what the United Nations agreed on earlier this week, that we have 17 sustainable development goals. Some of them you can readily agree to. No poverty, right? It's a clear goal. Wouldn't the world be lovely if we could eradicate poverty, zero hunger? What a fantastic idea. Another sustainable development goal is industry, innovation, and infrastructure. UN speak, right? This is not a goal. This is stuff. This is not the goal. Or life below water. What a beautiful goal we have. This is just the UN bill taking useful ideas and changing them into gobbledygook that don't even make grammatical sense anymore. These are the sort of 17 headlines. This is a different depiction of this. This is the 17 goals, and this is Ed Sheeran singing about them. This was on Sunday. I understand he's popular with your age group. I never saw the attraction. Anyway. And here are the 17 goals, now not bullet or not as icons, but as bullet points. So the first goal is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. End hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. This is not one goal, right? This end poverty in all its forms everywhere is actually not a goal either, because there's a big difference between rural poverty in Africa and urban poverty in Africa and urban poverty in London, right? All three are things we would like to get rid of, but they're definitely not the same, and the solutions are definitely not the same, right? So to, again, sort of like put them all in one goal, really, do we want to do that? Sure, a healthy life, inclusive and equitable and high-quality education, gender equality, sustainable management of water and sanitation. Well, we've lost our definition of sustainability by focusing on these goals. You may sort of think that the 17 goals define a new form of sustainability. That's not the case, because it's recursive, right? The goal, the sustainable development goal, is to be sustainable. It becomes tautological. This is not a definition of sustainability at all. These are just things that are worthwhile. This is fine. Access to affordable, reliable, clean, and modern energy for all. Sustained and inclusive economic growth. I actually got this wrong. Resilient infrastructure. The red-coded things here all come straight out of the left political agenda, right? The traditional left. Environment has gone. Here is a little bit for the third pillar, economic efficiency. Let's give it here in blue, the conservative color. It's a little bit left, it's all red. And it's only if you move to the second set of goals, then we see the environment come back. Here we noted in green, there's more red stuff, more things that Jeremy Corbyn would like. And there's also some green stuff, and then there's stuff that I couldn't classify. Take urgent action to combat climate change. The goal is to act, if you believe this. The goal is not to stabilize climate, which I would think is the goal. No, the goal is to be seen doing something. Sort of fuck parade style. Let's go do something. Not think about whether this actually meets our goal or whether it's at all sensible or a nice thing to do. No, let's go do something. That's apparently the goal of sustainable development nowadays. For the oceans, it's a bit more sensible, right? Conserve and use sustainably the ocean, seas, and the marine resources. Protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, forests, the desert, and so on and so forth. For some reason, biodiversity is important on land, but not in the sea. It's all a bit peculiar. The takeaway message here is, of course, that I started by defining sustainable development as environmental quality for us and for the future. And then I said, well, but then people introduced the 3 pillars, or rather they introduced pillar number 2 and 3. By now, 2015, environment is actually taking a back seat. They're not goals 1, 2, and 3, but rather they are goals 13, 14, and 15. Economic development has basically disappeared. It's a sub-goal somewhere. And all of it is the standard development agenda and the standard social equality agenda. And the notion, what is sustainability, between 87 and 1987 and 2015 has completely changed its complexion from something that came out of the environmental movement to something that is now out of the sustainability and equality development and equality movement. That's all I wanted to say.